Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had dreamed of joining the military since she was 12 years old, watching her older brother come home in his dress blues. Now, 3 years into her service, she stood at attention in the scorching Nevada sun at Fort Carson, sweat trickling down her back as Sergeant First Class Mike Thompson paced in front of the assembled platoon. Thompson was a Navy SEAL who had been temporarily assigned to their Army unit for joint training exercises. His reputation preceded him. Decorated combat veteran, expert in hand-to-hand combat, and unfortunately, someone who believed women had no place in combat roles. The 500 soldiers gathered for the morning training session represented multiple units, all there to learn advanced tactical techniques. Maria had worked twice as hard as anyone else to prove herself worthy of her position. At 5'6" and 140 pounds, she wasn't the biggest soldier, but her determination was unmatched. She had excelled in every training program, earned the respect of most of her peers, and maintained the highest physical fitness scores in her company. Yet Thompson seemed determined to make her life miserable. "Today we're going to demonstrate proper defensive techniques," Thompson announced, his voice carrying across the training ground. "When you're in close quarters combat, you need to know how to neutralize a threat quickly and efficiently." His eyes scanned the crowd and landed on Maria Rodriguez, front and center. Maria's stomach tightened, but she maintained her composure as she jogged to the front of the group. Thompson had called her out before during these demonstrations, always making her the example of what not to do, always finding ways to humiliate her in front of hundreds of watching eyes. Now, in a real combat situation, Thompson continued, positioning himself behind Maria, an enemy might try to grab you from behind. The key is to react quickly and decisively. Without warning, he wrapped his arm around her neck in what was supposed to be a demonstration chokehold. But his grip was unnecessarily tight. Maria followed protocol, executing the escape technique exactly as she had been trained. She bent forward, grabbed his arm, and twisted out of the hold cleanly and efficiently. The watching soldiers nodded approvingly. It was a textbook execution. But Thompson wasn't finished. "That was sloppy, Rodriguez. In a real fight, you'd be dead." He moved to grab her again, this time more aggressively. "Let me show you how a real soldier handles this situation." Maria sensed something was wrong. This wasn't standard training procedure anymore. Thompson's movements had become predatory, and the look in his eyes had shifted from professional instruction to something darker. She had dealt with his constant criticism and sexist comments for weeks, but this felt different. "Sergeant Thompson," she said quietly, "I believe I executed the technique correctly, according to the manual. Did I ask for your opinion, Rodriguez?" Thompson's voice rose, carrying clearly across the silent training ground. "Maybe if you spent less time running your mouth and more time in the gym, you might actually be able to defend yourself." The insult stung, particularly because Maria knew her physical fitness scores were higher than most of the men in the unit. But she held her tongue, knowing that any response would only escalate the situation. The hundreds of watching soldiers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension building between their instructors. "Let's try this again," Thompson said, moving behind her once more. "And this time, maybe try not to embarrass yourself and every woman who thinks she belongs in combat." When he grabbed her this time, his arm pressed harder against her throat than any training exercise called for. Maria could feel the malicious intent in his grip. This wasn't about teaching defensive techniques anymore. This was about putting her in her place, showing everyone that she didn't belong here. She executed the same escape technique, but Thompson immediately grabbed her again, this time with both hands on her shoulders, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises. The watching soldiers began to murmur, recognizing that this had moved beyond normal training. "Thompson, that's enough," called out Master Sergeant Davis from the side of the training area. Even the senior non-commissioned officers could see that this had crossed a line, but Thompson ignored the warning. His face was flushed with anger and something else, a need to dominate, to prove his superiority not just as a soldier but as a man. "One more time, Rodriguez. And this time, try to show these soldiers what a real warrior looks like." Maria's hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. She was angry. Angrier than she had ever been in her military career. 3 years of proving herself, of enduring constant questioning of her abilities, of watching lesser soldiers advance while she was held to impossibly high standards, all came flooding back. Every sexist comment, every unfair evaluation, every time she had been told she wasn't strong enough, fast enough, or good enough, crystallized in this moment. "I said, know your place," Thompson shouted, and without warning, his open hand struck her across the face in front of 500 watching soldiers. The crack of the slap echoed across the training ground like a gunshot. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Maria's cheek burned, and she could taste blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. The watching soldiers stood in shocked silence. They had just witnessed a senior non-commissioned officer assault a subordinate in front of hundreds of witnesses. Thompson's face showed a moment of satisfaction, as if he believed he had finally put this uppity female soldier in her place. He had crossed every line of military protocol, professional conduct, and basic human decency. But in that moment, he seemed to think he had won. He was wrong. Maria had spent years training in martial arts before joining the military. Her father, worried about his daughter's safety, had enrolled her in jiu-jitsu classes when she was 8 years old. By the time she enlisted, she held a black belt and had competed in several tournaments. She had never used these skills against a fellow soldier, had never even considered it necessary. But Thompson had just changed the rules of engagement. Maria's response was swift, precise, and devastating. As Thompson stood there savoring his moment of dominance, she moved. Her right hand shot out and grabbed his left wrist in a grip that would have impressed her old sensei. Before Thompson could react, she pivoted her body and applied pressure to his wrist joint in a technique known as a standing kimura. The sound of his wrist breaking was audible even to the soldiers standing 50 feet away. Thompson's eyes went wide with shock and pain as he instinctively tried to pull away. But Maria's grip was unbreakable. In the same fluid motion, she captured his right wrist with her left hand and applied the same technique. 2 more distinct snapping sounds echoed across the training ground as Thompson's second wrist broke. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. Thompson fell to his knees, both hands hanging at impossible angles, his face contorted with pain and disbelief. The Navy SEAL who had dominated enemy combatants in 3 combat deployments had just been defeated by the woman he had tried to humiliate. Maria released his wrists and stepped back, her face calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She looked down at Thompson, who was cradling his broken wrists against his chest, tears of pain streaming down his face. "I know my place, Sergeant," she said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the absolute silence of the training ground. "My place is here, defending myself and my fellow soldiers from bullies like you." The 500 soldiers who had witnessed the entire encounter stood in stunned silence. They had just seen something unprecedented. A junior soldier successfully defending herself against a senior non-commissioned officer who had crossed every line of acceptable conduct. Master Sergeant Davis was the first to move, jogging over to assess the situation. Behind him, other senior leaders were already reaching for their radios, calling for medical personnel and military police. This incident would trigger investigations, court-martial proceedings, and changes in policy that would ripple throughout the entire military structure. But in that moment, as Thompson whimpered on the ground and Maria stood at attention despite her burning cheek, every soldier present understood that they had witnessed something more than just a training exercise gone wrong. They had seen what happened when someone finally decided that enough was enough. Maria Rodriguez had found her voice, and she had used it to speak a language that bullies understood. The language of consequences. The question now was whether the military justice system would support a soldier who had defended herself, or whether the old boys network would close ranks to protect one of their own. The answer to that question would determine not just Maria's future, but the future of every woman serving in the armed forces. As the sirens of approaching ambulances and military police vehicles grew louder, Maria knew that her real fight was just beginning. The military police arrived within minutes, their vehicles kicking up dust as they surrounded the training area. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez remained at attention as Sergeant First Class Mike Thompson was loaded into an ambulance, his broken wrists already swelling despite the ice packs the medics had applied. The 500 soldiers who had witnessed the incident were ordered to remain in formation while investigators began the process of interviewing witnesses. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the military police unit commander, was a 15-year veteran who had seen her share of incidents involving misconduct and violence. But as she surveyed the scene and received the initial reports from Master Sergeant Davis, she realized this case would be unlike anything she had handled before. A female soldier had just broken both wrists of a decorated Navy SEAL in front of hundreds of witnesses, and the circumstances leading to that moment would determine whether charges would be filed. Maria was immediately separated from the other soldiers and placed in what the military euphemistically called administrative segregation. Essentially, she was confined to her barracks room while the investigation proceeded. 2 military police officers escorted her back to her quarters, where she was told to remain until further notice. Her chain of command was notified, and within hours, the incident had reached the attention of officers all the way up to the base commander. The first 48 hours were crucial. Captain Walsh interviewed dozens of witnesses, and their accounts were remarkably consistent. Thompson had been conducting what appeared to be a legitimate training exercise, but his behavior toward Rodriguez had been inappropriate from the beginning. Multiple soldiers testified that his comments had been unprofessional and that his physical handling of Rodriguez during the demonstration had exceeded normal training parameters. Then came the moment that changed everything. Multiple witnesses, including several senior non-commissioned officers, confirmed that Thompson had struck Rodriguez across the face without any provocation. The slap had been clearly audible and visible to hundreds of soldiers. What happened next? Rodriguez's swift defensive action that resulted in Thompson's injuries took on an entirely different legal complexion in light of that testimony. Meanwhile, Rodriguez sat in her small barracks room, replaying the events over and over in her mind. She had acted on pure instinct, her martial arts training taking over when she felt threatened and humiliated. But now, in the quiet hours of confinement, the full weight of what had happened began to settle in. She had seriously injured a senior non-commissioned officer. Her military career was almost certainly over, and she might face criminal charges. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her door. Captain Sarah Chen, the base legal assistance officer, had been assigned to advise Rodriguez on her rights and potential legal exposure. Chen was a sharp attorney who had handled numerous military justice cases, and she had spent the previous day reviewing witness statements and consulting with her colleagues about the unprecedented nature of the case. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Chen said, as she entered the room, carrying a thick folder of documents. "I'm here to discuss your legal situation and help you understand what happens next." Maria had expected the worst: charges of assault, reduction in rank, possible imprisonment. But as Chen explained the initial findings of the investigation, a different picture began to emerge. "The witnesses are unanimous that Sergeant Thompson struck you first," Chen said, spreading copies of witness statements across the small desk. "Under both military and civilian law, you have the right to defend yourself when faced with an unprovoked assault. The question the investigating officer will have to answer is whether your response was proportional to the threat you faced." This was the crux of the legal issue. Thompson's slap, while clearly assault, had not caused serious injury. Rodriguez's response, while defensive in nature, had resulted in 2 broken wrists that would require surgery and months of rehabilitation. Military prosecutors would have to determine whether charging Rodriguez would serve the interests of justice or simply protect a system that had failed to protect her from harassment and assault. As the investigation continued, more details about Thompson's behavior emerged. Rodriguez wasn't his first target. Captain Walsh's team discovered a pattern of inappropriate conduct dating back months. Female soldiers in previous units had filed informal complaints about Thompson's attitude and behavior, but nothing had been formally documented or investigated. The military's own failure to address earlier warning signs was now part of the official record. The story was also beginning to attract attention outside the military. Someone had recorded parts of the incident on their phone, and despite strict regulations against unauthorized recording on military installations, the video had somehow made its way to social media. Within days, news outlets were picking up the story, and it was becoming a national conversation about women in the military, sexual harassment, and the right to self-defense. Colonel Robert Hayes, the base commander, found himself fielding calls from reporters, members of Congress, and advocacy groups. The incident had struck a nerve with people far beyond the military community. Women's rights organizations were hailing Rodriguez as a hero who had stood up to systemic harassment. Veterans groups were divided, with some supporting Rodriguez's right to defend herself, and others arguing that military discipline required soldiers to follow proper channels for addressing misconduct. The pressure on the military justice system was immense. A decision to prosecute Rodriguez would likely be seen as the military protecting its own and punishing a victim for fighting back, but failing to take any action might be interpreted as condoning violence against superior officers, regardless of the circumstances. Meanwhile, Thompson was recovering from surgery at the base hospital. Both of his wrists had required metal plates and screws to repair the damage, and doctors warned that he might never regain full use of his hands. The injuries would almost certainly end his military career, and the circumstances surrounding them had already triggered an investigation into his own conduct. As Thompson lay in his hospital bed, he was beginning to understand the full scope of what his moment of anger had cost him. Military investigators had informed him that he was being recommended for court-martial on charges of assault and conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer. His 12-year military career, which had included multiple decorations for valor in combat, was effectively over. But Thompson wasn't going quietly. His attorney, a civilian lawyer with experience defending military personnel, was preparing to argue that Rodriguez had used excessive force in her response. They planned to claim that a martial arts expert had an obligation to use the minimum force necessary to defend herself, and that breaking both wrists of her attacker exceeded that standard. This legal strategy would force the military to examine not just what happened in those crucial seconds, but what Rodriguez's training and capabilities meant for her legal responsibilities. If someone with advanced martial arts skills had a higher duty to show restraint, it could set a precedent that would affect military personnel throughout the services. By the end of the first week, the investigation had generated hundreds of pages of testimony, medical reports, and legal analysis. Captain Walsh submitted her findings to the staff judge advocate, recommending that charges be filed against Thompson for assault and conduct unbecoming, while suggesting that Rodriguez's actions fell within the legal boundaries of self-defense. But the final decision would rest with Colonel Hayes and his legal team. They had to weigh the evidence, the legal precedents, and the broader implications of their decision. Whatever they decided would send a message to every soldier in the military about what was acceptable conduct and what consequences would follow when those standards were violated. Rodriguez continued to wait in her barracks room, checking in daily with her chain of command but otherwise isolated from her unit and her normal duties. She spent her time reading, exercising in her small space, and trying to process what her life might look like after this incident. She had joined the military to serve her country and prove that women could excel in any role. Now she faced the possibility that her career would be defined by those 3 seconds, when she had decided that enough was enough. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day brought rumors about what the command was planning to do, but no official word came down. Rodriguez knew that somewhere in the base headquarters, officers were debating her fate and Thompson's. The decision they reached would determine whether she would be remembered as a soldier who stood up for herself or as someone who had let her emotions override military discipline. As the second week of the investigation began, Rodriguez received word that her case had been referred to a formal Article 32 hearing, the military equivalent of a grand jury proceeding. This meant that formal charges were being considered, but it didn't indicate whether those charges would be filed against her, Thompson, or both. The hearing would be her first opportunity to tell her side of the story in a formal setting. It would also be the moment when the military would have to decide what kind of institution it wanted to be. One that protected bullies and perpetuated harassment, or one that stood behind soldiers who refused to be victims. The Article 32 hearing convened 3 weeks after the incident that had turned Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez's world upside down. The proceedings were held in the base's largest conference room, which had been converted into a makeshift courtroom for the occasion. Major Patricia Williams, a seasoned military judge advocate with 20 years of experience, presided over the hearing that would determine whether formal charges would be filed and against whom. Rodriguez sat at the defense table with Captain Sarah Chen, her military-appointed counsel, and Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a civilian defense attorney who had volunteered to assist with her case pro bono. Morrison was a former Army JAG officer who had left active duty to specialize in military justice cases, particularly those involving women in the military. He had followed Rodriguez's case in the media and believed it represented a crucial moment in the ongoing struggle for gender equality in the armed forces. Across the room, Sergeant First Class Mike Thompson sat with his legal team, his hands still in casts from the surgery to repair his broken wrists. His attorney, David Palmer, was an aggressive defense lawyer who specialized in defending military personnel accused of misconduct. Palmer's strategy was straightforward. He would argue that Rodriguez had used excessive force in response to what amounted to a minor assault, and that her martial arts training made her response particularly dangerous and unnecessary. The hearing began with testimony from the numerous witnesses to the incident. One by one, soldiers who had been present during the training exercise took the stand and recounted what they had seen. Their testimony was remarkably consistent. Thompson had conducted himself unprofessionally throughout the demonstration, had made inappropriate comments about women in combat roles, and had escalated the situation far beyond normal training parameters. Master Sergeant Davis was particularly effective as a witness. As the senior non-commissioned officer present during the incident, his testimony carried significant weight with the hearing officer. In my 22 years of military service, Davis testified, I have never seen a training exercise conducted the way Sergeant Thompson conducted that demonstration. His behavior was unprofessional. His comments were inappropriate. And his physical handling of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez exceeded any reasonable training standard. When Davis described the moment Thompson struck Rodriguez, the room fell silent. There was no justification for what he did, Davis continued. None whatsoever. He hit her because he was angry and because he thought he could get away with it. In my opinion, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez did exactly what any soldier should do when faced with an unprovoked assault. She defended herself. Palmer tried to undermine Davis's testimony during cross-examination, suggesting that the senior NCO was biased in favor of Rodriguez because of political correctness and pressure to support women in combat roles. But Davis's response was devastating. Sir, I've served with courage under fire. I've seen soldiers who belonged in combat and soldiers who didn't, and it had nothing to do with their gender. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has proven herself repeatedly. Sergeant Thompson, on the other hand, just proved that he's a bully who can't control his temper. The medical testimony regarding Thompson's injuries was also crucial to the case. The orthopedic surgeon who had operated on his wrists testified that the breaks were clean and precise, indicating that whoever caused them had significant training and skill. But he also noted that the techniques used were consistent with defensive martial arts moves, designed to disable an attacker quickly and efficiently. These injuries are serious, the doctor testified, but they're not the kind of injuries you see when someone is trying to cause maximum harm. They're precisely applied breaks designed to immediately stop an attacker from using his hands. In my medical opinion, whoever did this was trying to neutralize a threat, not inflict gratuitous injury. Rodriguez herself took the stand on the second day of the hearing. She had spent hours preparing with her legal team, but she was determined to tell the truth about what had happened and why she had reacted the way she did. I joined the military to serve my country, she testified, her voice clear and steady despite the pressure of the moment. I've worked harder than anyone to prove that I belong here, that I can do the job as well as any man. For 3 years, I've endured comments about my abilities, questions about whether women should be in combat roles, and constant pressure to prove myself over and over again. She described the training exercise and Thompson's escalating aggression. When he grabbed me during the demonstration, it wasn't training anymore. I could feel the anger in his grip, the intent to hurt me, to humiliate me in front of 500 soldiers. But even then, I followed protocol. I executed the escape techniques exactly as I was trained. Rodriguez's voice remained steady as she described the moment Thompson struck her. When he hit me, something changed. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every woman in the military who had been told to be quiet, to take it, to not make waves. I realized that if I didn't defend myself, if I just took it and filed a complaint later, nothing would change. The message to every soldier watching would be that it's okay to hit female soldiers as long as you outrank them. Her description of her defensive response was clinical and precise. I used techniques I learned as a child to protect myself from someone who was bigger and stronger than me. I didn't think about his rank or his reputation. I thought about the fact that he had just committed assault in front of hundreds of witnesses, and I had the right to defend myself. Palmer's cross-examination was intense but ineffective. He tried to paint Rodriguez as a trained weapon who had used excessive force, but her responses were calm and thoughtful. When he suggested that she should have simply reported the incident through proper channels instead of responding with violence, her answer resonated throughout the hearing room. Sir, with respect, proper channels had failed. Multiple women had complained about Sergeant Thompson's behavior, and nothing had been done. In that moment, when he struck me in front of 500 soldiers, proper channels weren't going to protect me or any other female soldier from a man who thought his rank gave him the right to assault subordinates. The testimony phase concluded with character witnesses for both Rodriguez and Thompson. Rodriguez's witnesses painted a picture of a dedicated, professional soldier who had excelled in every assignment and earned the respect of her peers and superiors. Thompson's witnesses described his combat record and his contributions to training programs, but notably, none of them addressed his treatment of female soldiers or his attitude toward women in combat roles. After 2 days of testimony, Major Williams recessed the hearing to consider the evidence and make her recommendation. Rodriguez returned to her barracks to wait for a decision that would determine her future in the military and possibly her freedom. The decision came 3 days later. Major Williams reconvened the hearing and delivered her findings in a packed courtroom that included military personnel, reporters, and advocacy groups from around the country. This case, Major Williams began, represents more than just a dispute between two soldiers. It represents a fundamental question about what we expect from our military personnel and how we protect those who serve our country. She detailed the evidence methodically, noting Thompson's pattern of inappropriate behavior, his escalation of the training exercise beyond acceptable parameters, and his unprovoked assault on Rodriguez. She also addressed the question of proportionality in Rodriguez's response. While Sergeant Thompson's injuries are serious, Williams continued, the evidence clearly shows that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez used defensive techniques designed to immediately neutralize a threat. She did not continue her attack after Thompson was disabled. She did not use more force than necessary to protect herself, and she acted within the scope of her right to self-defense. The room was silent as Williams delivered her recommendations. I find that the evidence does not support charges against Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Her actions were justified under both military law and basic principles of self-defense. I do, however, recommend that charges be filed against Sergeant Thompson for assault, conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer, and violation of his oath to support and defend all soldiers under his command. The collective exhale in the courtroom was audible. Rodriguez felt tears of relief rolling down her cheeks as Captain Chen squeezed her shoulder. Across the room, Thompson stared at the floor, knowing that his military career was over and that he faced the possibility of imprisonment and a dishonorable discharge. But the legal proceedings were only the beginning of Rodriguez's vindication. Within hours of the hearing officer's decision, Colonel Hayes announced that the command was accepting the recommendations in full. Charges against Rodriguez were dismissed, and she was ordered back to active duty immediately. Thompson would face a general court-martial on multiple charges. The story exploded in the national media. Rodriguez found herself thrust into the spotlight as a symbol of women's rights and military reform. Interview requests poured in from news networks, magazines, and documentary filmmakers. Advocacy groups wanted her to speak at their events. Politicians cited her case in speeches about military justice and gender equality. Rodriguez handled the attention with the same professionalism she had shown throughout the ordeal. She agreed to a few carefully selected interviews, always emphasizing that her actions were about self-defense, not making a political statement. I didn't set out to change anything, she said in an interview with a national news magazine. I just refused to be a victim. The impact of her case extended far beyond her individual situation. Within months, the military implemented new training programs focused on preventing harassment and assault. Reporting procedures were streamlined, and commanders were held more accountable for addressing misconduct in their units. Rodriguez's case became a mandatory part of training curricula for all military personnel, used as an example of both the importance of treating all soldiers with respect and the consequences that would follow when that standard was violated. Thompson's court-martial proceeded 6 months later. He was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 3 years in military prison, reduction to the lowest enlisted rank, and a dishonorable discharge. His conviction effectively ended any possibility of him receiving veterans' benefits or finding employment in fields that required security clearances. Rodriguez, meanwhile, continued her military service with distinction. She was promoted to Sergeant First Class ahead of her peers and was selected for advanced leadership training. Her unit commanders, initially uncertain about how to handle a soldier who had become a national figure, discovered that Rodriguez was exactly the same professional, dedicated soldier she had always been. 2 years after the incident, Rodriguez was selected for officer candidate school. She had decided that she could make a greater impact as an officer, working to ensure that other soldiers never had to face the kind of harassment and abuse she had endured. Her application essay was a powerful reflection on leadership, justice, and the responsibility to protect those who serve. True leadership, she wrote, isn't about rank or authority. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it costs you something. I learned that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought against foreign enemies. They're fought within our own ranks, against the attitudes and behaviors that diminish all of us. Rodriguez's story became a turning point in military culture. Her refusal to accept abuse, combined with the military justice system's ultimate decision to support her, sent a clear message throughout the armed forces. The days of harassment and abuse being tolerated or ignored were ending, and those who thought they could prey on fellow soldiers with impunity were learning that there would be consequences. The incident that began as a routine training exercise had evolved into something much larger. A moment of reckoning for an institution that prided itself on honor, courage, and commitment. Rodriguez had embodied all 3 of those values in those crucial seconds when she decided that enough was enough. Years later, as Lieutenant Rodriguez led her own soldiers in training exercises, she would often think about that day in the Nevada sun. She had learned that sometimes, knowing your place meant refusing to accept the place that others tried to assign to you. Sometimes it meant standing up, fighting back, and demanding better. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who would come after you. Her place, she had discovered, was wherever she chose to stand and fight for what was right. And that, she had learned, was the most important lesson of all.